The emergency meeting convened at midnight in the most secure conference room at Buckingham Palace. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his face drawn and pale in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Around him gathered his most trusted advisors: Private Secretary Michael Hartwell, Press Secretary Victoria Ashford, Legal Counsel Sir Geoffrey Thornton, and Head of Palace Security Commander David Price. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Sir Geoffrey laid out the legal implications of the situation. "Your Majesty, if these allegations prove true, we are facing a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. A legitimate heir born outside of marriage could challenge the entire line of succession. The legal ramifications alone could tie up the courts for decades." Victoria Ashford was equally blunt about the media storm that was brewing. "The journalist, Sarah Mitchell, has given us 48 hours to respond before publication. Her reputation is impeccable, and she clearly believes the evidence is solid. Once this story breaks, every media outlet in the world will be demanding answers." Charles had been silent throughout most of the meeting, staring at the DNA report that Michael had placed before him. The scientific evidence was undeniable, but it was the photographs that truly convinced him. James Windsor was unmistakably his son, bearing not just his features but those of his own father, Prince Philip, in the jawline and bearing. "I remember her," Charles said quietly, breaking the tense silence. "Margaret Ashworth. She worked at Cambridge during my lecture series on environmental conservation. She was intelligent, beautiful, and kind. Our relationship lasted only a few months, but she disappeared suddenly, without explanation." "Did you know about the child?" Commander Price asked directly. Charles considered the question carefully. "I suspected something was wrong when she vanished. She wouldn't return my calls or letters. A few months later, I made an anonymous donation to a children's charity in the town where I learned she had moved. I told myself it was coincidence, but perhaps deep down I knew." The room fell silent as everyone processed this admission. The king had potentially known about his illegitimate son for over 30 years and had done nothing to acknowledge or support him beyond a single charitable donation. "There's something else you need to know," Michael said reluctantly. "Our security review of the dismissal incident has revealed that several palace staff members recorded the encounter on their mobile phones. The footage shows you publicly humiliating a guard who maintained perfect military bearing throughout. If this video surfaces alongside the paternity claims, the damage to your reputation will be catastrophic." Charles closed his eyes, remembering that morning in vivid detail. He had been frustrated and tired, taking out months of accumulated stress on a young man who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. The irony that this young man was his own son made his behavior seem even more monstrous. "What are my options?" he asked finally. Sir Geoffrey opened a thick legal folder. "Legally, we could challenge the DNA evidence, demand new tests, question the chain of custody. We could tie this up in court for years and probably discredit the story in the process." "And morally?" The question hung in the air for several seconds before Victoria answered. "Morally, Your Majesty, you humiliated your own son in front of dozens of people because you thought he was showing insufficient respect to his social superiors. The optics are devastating no matter how we approach this." Meanwhile, James Windsor was dealing with his own crisis of conscience. The decision to go public with his story had seemed clear-cut when he was angry about his dismissal, but now he was beginning to understand the full implications of his actions. Sarah Mitchell had explained that the story would likely lead to demands for his recognition in the line of succession, potentially ahead of Prince William and his children. The constitutional chaos this could create might damage the monarchy beyond repair, affecting millions of people who had no part in this family drama. "I need you to understand something," Sarah had told him during their final meeting before publication. "Once this story breaks, your life will never be the same. You'll be the most famous person in Britain, possibly the world. Every decision you've ever made will be scrutinized, every relationship examined. Are you prepared for that?" James had spent sleepless nights considering this question. His mother Margaret had died 5 years earlier from cancer, taking her secrets to the grave. She had never wanted this truth to emerge, believing it would only bring pain to everyone involved. But her son could no longer carry the burden of secrecy, especially after experiencing firsthand the arrogance and cruelty of the man who had abandoned him. The breaking point came when James received an unexpected phone call. "Mr. Windsor, this is Michael Hartwell from Buckingham Palace. His Majesty would like to arrange a private meeting with you before any story is published. Would you be willing to discuss this matter in person?" The meeting was arranged for the following evening in a private room at a discreet London hotel. James arrived first, dressed in his best civilian clothes and carrying the original documents that proved his parentage. He waited nervously, uncertain what to expect from this first real encounter with his biological father. When King Charles entered the room 30 minutes later, accompanied only by Commander Price, James was struck by how much older and more fragile the king appeared compared to his public image. The weight of the crown seemed to have aged him considerably in just the few months since his coronation. "James," Charles said simply, using his real name for the first time. "I owe you an apology." Several apologies, actually. For the next 2 hours, father and son sat across from each other and had the conversation that should have happened 30 years earlier. Charles explained the pressures he had been under during his failed first marriage, his brief relationship with Margaret, and his suspicions about the sudden pregnancy and disappearance. "I should have tried harder to find her, to support both of you properly," Charles admitted. "Fear of scandal seemed more important than doing what was right. That was cowardice on my part." James listened quietly, occasionally asking questions, but mostly trying to reconcile this thoughtful, remorseful man with the arrogant king who had dismissed him so cruelly weeks earlier. "Why did you treat me the way you did that morning?" James asked finally. Charles was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Honestly, you looked familiar, and it made me uncomfortable. Something about your bearing, your confidence, reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place. Instead of trying to understand that feeling, I lashed out. I've been doing that too much lately, taking out my frustrations on people who don't deserve it." "Do you want to acknowledge me publicly?" James asked. "That's not really my decision to make alone," Charles replied. "This affects the entire royal family, the line of succession, the stability of the monarchy itself. But, more importantly, what do you want?" It was a question James had been asking himself for weeks. Did he want to be a prince? Did he want the throne? Did he want to destroy the institution that his father represented? "I want you to be a better king," James said finally. "I want you to remember that the people who serve you are human beings deserving of respect, regardless of their birth or station. I want you to understand that real leadership means lifting people up, not putting them down to make yourself feel more powerful." Charles nodded slowly. "And if I promise to do better, to be the king this country deserves, would you consider keeping this between us?" James looked at his father for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the man behind the crown. "The story is going to break tomorrow whether I participate or not. Sarah Mitchell has enough evidence to publish with or without my cooperation. But how we respond to it, how we handle the aftermath, that's still up to us." The next morning, as newspaper headlines around the world screamed about the secret royal heir and the king's cruel dismissal of his own son, both men were already working together on a response that would either save the monarchy or transform it into something entirely new. The British public, waking up to the biggest royal scandal in generations, would soon discover that sometimes the most shocking revelations can lead to the most unexpected reconciliations. But whether King Charles could truly change, whether James could forgive, and whether the monarchy itself could survive this crisis remained questions that only time would answer. In the end, the guard who had been dismissed for showing insufficient deference had forced his king to confront the most important truth of all. That true authority comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it through how you treat those who have no power to hurt you in return. 3 weeks after his dismissal, James Windsor sat in the cramped office of investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell. The cluttered room smelled of stale coffee and old newspapers, but Sarah herself was sharp as a razor. She had built her career on exposing corruption and cover-ups among Britain's elite, and something about James's story had caught her attention immediately. "You understand what you're asking me to do," Sarah said, leaning back in her chair as she studied the documents spread across her desk. "If this is true, if these DNA results are legitimate, this could bring down the entire monarchy." James nodded slowly. "I've thought about nothing else for weeks. But after what happened in that courtyard, after the way he treated me like I was nothing, I realized something important. If this is how he behaves toward people he thinks are beneath him, what kind of king will he be? Sarah picked up one of the photographs, a faded image showing a much younger Prince Charles with a beautiful dark-haired woman. The woman's features were clearly reflected in James's face, but more striking was the unmistakable resemblance between Charles and the man sitting across from her. Your mother kept all of this? She was careful. She knew that one day, the truth might need to come out. She documented everything from their relationship, kept copies of his letters, even managed to get a DNA sample when I was 10 years old. James pointed to the medical report. That test was done by Dr. Richard Pemberton. He's still practicing medicine in London. You can verify everything. Sarah had already begun that process. Her preliminary investigation into James's background had revealed a man with an exemplary military record, no criminal history, and no apparent motive for fraud. The timing of his birth matched perfectly with documented gaps in Charles's public schedule during 1991. What exactly do you want to achieve? She asked. Revenge? Money? Recognition? Justice? James replied without hesitation. Not just for me, but for everyone who has to bow and scrape before people who think their blood makes them better than everyone else. I served 8 years in the military, risked my life for this country multiple times. But, in his eyes, I'm just another servant to be dismissed when I don't meet his standards of subservience. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, King Charles was dealing with his own set of problems. The dismissal of the guard had been reported in several newspapers, though most treated it as a minor story about royal protocol. However, some commentators had begun questioning whether the new king's behavior suggested a troubling pattern of arrogance. Private Secretary Michael Hartwell approached Charles during his afternoon tea, carrying a folder of press clippings and correspondence. Your Majesty, there are some matters we need to discuss regarding the incident with Private Ashworth. Charles looked up irritably. What about it? The matter was resolved. The man was clearly unsuited for royal service. There have been several inquiries from journalists about the dismissal. Some are suggesting that your reaction was disproportionate to any offense the guard might have committed. Disproportionate? Charles's voice rose. The man's attitude was completely inappropriate. Standing there like he owned the place, looking at me as if he was judging my every move. I will not tolerate such disrespect. Michael chose his words carefully. Of course, Your Majesty. However, some of the palace staff who witnessed the event have described the guard as polite and professional throughout the encounter. Then, the palace staff clearly don't understand proper protocol either, Charles snapped. Perhaps we need to review everyone's understanding of their position here. As Michael left the room, he couldn't shake his growing concern about the king's behavior. Charles had always been particular about protocol, but this level of hostility towards staff members was new and troubling. What Michael didn't know was that Charles himself was struggling with doubts about his ability to fulfill his role as king, and these doubts were manifesting as anger toward anyone who seemed to challenge his authority. Back in London, Sarah Mitchell was conducting her own investigation into the dismissed guard's claims. She had spent days verifying documents, interviewing sources, and building a timeline that would either prove or disprove James's story. What she discovered exceeded even her expectations. Dr. Pemberton confirmed that he had indeed conducted the DNA test in 2001, using samples provided by Margaret Ashworth and obtained during a public appearance by Prince Charles. The results were conclusive. There was a 99.7% probability that Charles was James's biological father. More importantly, Sarah's research into Margaret Ashworth revealed a woman with no history of deception or fraud. Former colleagues at Cambridge University remembered her as quiet, intelligent, and dedicated to her work. Several people recalled her sudden departure in late 1991, though none knew the reason for it. She just disappeared one day, explained Professor Helen Davies, who had worked alongside Margaret in the university library. She was a private person, but we all noticed the change in her behavior during those last few months. She seemed scared, constantly looking over her shoulder. Then, one morning, she simply didn't come to work. Sarah also discovered something that made James's story even more compelling. In 1992, just months after Margaret's disappearance, Prince Charles had made a substantial anonymous donation to a children's charity in the exact town where Margaret had settled. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. When confronted with this information, James looked stunned. I never knew about any donation. My mother never mentioned it. It suggests that your father might have known about your existence, at least initially, Sarah explained. Perhaps your mother contacted him when you were born, and this was his way of providing support without acknowledging paternity. This revelation changed everything for James. If Charles had known about him all along, then his dismissal from the palace took on an entirely different meaning. Had the king recognized him? Was the cruel treatment a deliberate attempt to drive away an inconvenient reminder of past mistakes? As Sarah continued her investigation, she uncovered more evidence of Charles's pattern of dismissive behavior towards staff members. Palace workers, speaking on condition of anonymity, described a man who had become increasingly volatile since becoming king. Several guards and servants had been dismissed or transferred for minor infractions that would previously have resulted in simple warnings. He's changed, one long-term employee confided. The pressure of the crown has made him suspicious of everyone around him. He sees challenges to his authority everywhere, even when they don't exist. The picture that emerged was of a king struggling with the weight of his responsibilities and taking out his frustrations on those least able to defend themselves. But James's case represented something far more significant than workplace bullying. If the DNA evidence was accurate, Charles had unknowingly humiliated and dismissed his own son in front of dozens of witnesses. 3 days before Sarah planned to publish her story, she made one final attempt to reach out to the palace for comment. She sent a detailed letter to Michael Hartwell, outlining the allegations and requesting an official response. The letter included copies of key documents and a clear statement that the story would be published with or without palace cooperation. Michael read the letter 3 times before requesting an immediate private audience with the king. When he entered Charles's study that evening, his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. Your Majesty, we have a serious problem. A very serious problem indeed. Charles looked up from his correspondence, immediately sensing the gravity of the situation. What is it? It concerns the guard you dismissed 3 weeks ago, the one named Thomas Ashworth. Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. It appears his real name is James Windsor, and he claims to be your son. The color drained from Charles's face as Michael handed him the letter. As the king read through the allegations and examined the evidence, a terrible realization began to dawn on him. He remembered Margaret Ashworth, remembered their brief affair during one of the darkest periods of his first marriage. He remembered her sudden disappearance and his own anonymous donation to the children's charity, made out of guilt and concern. But, most clearly, he remembered the green eyes of the guard he had dismissed so cruelly, and how familiar they had seemed in that moment. Eyes that now, with the weight of this revelation, he recognized as his own. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as King Charles walked briskly toward the main entrance. His polished shoes clicked against the ancient stones, each step echoing his growing frustration. Today was supposed to be a simple ceremony, nothing more than a routine medal presentation to war veterans. But even the smallest events seemed to drain his energy these days. As he approached the grand doors, he noticed one of the royal guards standing at attention. The young man looked to be in his early 30s, tall and lean with sharp features that seemed oddly familiar. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his posture flawless, but something about him irritated the king immediately. You there, Charles called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Step forward. The guard moved with military precision, stopping exactly 3 paces away and offering a crisp salute. Your Majesty. Charles studied the man's face, trying to place where he had seen those features before. The guard's eyes were a striking green, almost emerald in the morning light. His jawline was strong, his bearing confident despite the obvious attempt at military subservience. What is your name? The king demanded. Private Thomas Ashworth, Your Majesty. The name meant nothing to Charles, but something about this guard's presence unsettled him. Perhaps it was the way Thomas held himself, or the slight defiance that seemed to lurk behind his respectful exterior. Whatever it was, the king found it deeply annoying. How long have you been serving here, Private Ashworth? 3 months, Your Majesty. 3 months. And already you carry yourself like you own the place. Charles's voice grew sharper. I've been watching you, and your attitude is unacceptable. You stand there like you're better than your position." Thomas remained perfectly still, but Charles caught the brief flash of something in those green eyes. Anger? Resentment? It only fueled the king's irritation. "Your Majesty, I apologize if I have given any offense. That was never my intention. Intention or not, your bearing is inappropriate for a servant of the crown." Charles stepped closer, his voice rising slightly. "You seem to forget your place in this hierarchy. You are here to serve, not to stand around looking like you're evaluating everything around you." The other guards nearby shifted uncomfortably, though none dared to intervene. This was not how the king typically behaved, but the stress of recent months had been taking its toll. The constant scrutiny from the press, the endless obligations, and the weight of the crown seemed to have shortened his patience considerably. "I understand, Your Majesty," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the public humiliation. "Do you? Because from where I stand, you look like someone who thinks they deserve to be somewhere else entirely." Charles was warming to his theme now, months of frustration finding an outlet in this moment. "Perhaps you believe you're too good for this work? Too refined? Too educated?" Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. "I want you transferred immediately," Charles announced loudly enough for everyone in the courtyard to hear. "Your services are no longer required at Buckingham Palace. Whatever gave you the idea that you belonged here was clearly a mistake." "Your Majesty," Thomas began, but Charles cut him off with a sharp gesture. "The decision is final. Report to your commanding officer and arrange for your immediate reassignment. Somewhere more suitable for someone with your obvious sense of entitlement." The king turned on his heel and strode toward the palace doors, leaving Thomas standing alone in the courtyard. The other guards quickly averted their eyes, embarrassed to have witnessed such a scene. As Charles disappeared into the building, Thomas finally allowed his military bearing to relax slightly. What the king didn't know, what no one in that courtyard knew, was that Thomas Ashworth was not just another guard seeking employment. He was not even Thomas Ashworth, if the truth were told. His real name was James Windsor, and he was the product of a secret that had been carefully hidden for over 30 years. In 1991, during a particularly difficult period in his first marriage, the then Prince Charles had begun a brief affair with a young woman named Margaret Ashworth. She was a commoner, working as a librarian at Cambridge University, where Charles had been giving a series of lectures on environmental conservation. Their relationship lasted only 3 months, but it had consequences that neither of them could have predicted. When Margaret discovered she was pregnant, she made a decision that would change everything. Rather than create a scandal that could damage the monarchy, she chose to disappear quietly. She left Cambridge, moved to a small town in northern England, and raised her son in complete secrecy. She told no one who the father was, not even her own family. James grew up knowing only that his father was someone important whom his mother refused to discuss. Margaret worked multiple jobs to support them, always ensuring that James received a good education despite their modest circumstances. She saved every penny she could, determined that her son would have opportunities in life. When James turned 18, Margaret finally told him the truth about his parentage. She showed him the few photographs she had kept from her time with Charles, along with letters he had written to her during their brief romance. The resemblance between father and son was unmistakable once James knew what to look for. "Your father is now the Prince of Wales," Margaret had explained quietly. "One day he will be king. But he doesn't know about you, and it must stay that way. The world isn't ready for this truth, and neither is he." James had struggled with this revelation for years. Part of him wanted to reach out, to make contact with his biological father. But he understood the implications. A secret heir to the throne, born outside of marriage, could destabilize the entire monarchy if the knowledge became public. Instead, he chose a different path. He enlisted in the military, serving with distinction for 8 years before applying for a position with the Royal Guard. He told himself it was simply curiosity, a desire to see the man who had given him life from a safe distance. He never intended to reveal himself or create problems. But, standing in that courtyard, having been publicly dismissed by his own father without Charles having the slightest idea who he was, James felt something shift inside him. The man he had watched from afar for months was nothing like the person he had imagined. Charles was petty, cruel to those he perceived as beneath him, and completely disconnected from the real world. As James walked slowly toward the guard's quarters to collect his belongings, he thought about his mother's words from all those years ago. She had been wrong about one thing. The world was changing, and perhaps it was ready for the truth after all. That evening, James sat in his small apartment staring at an old shoebox that contained everything he had of his father: letters, photographs, and, most importantly, a medical report that proved his parentage beyond any doubt. His mother had insisted on a DNA test when he was young, using a sample obtained during one of Charles's public appearances. For 32 years, this secret had remained buried. But, as James looked at his dismissal papers, officially removing him from royal service for inappropriate conduct and attitude, he began to wonder if the time for secrets was coming to an end. The king had made it clear what he thought of commoners who dared to stand in his presence with dignity and pride. But what would his reaction be when he learned that the guard he had dismissed so cruelly was actually his own flesh and blood? And, more importantly, what would the British people think when they learned that their new king had treated his own secret son like a piece of garbage to be thrown away? James carefully closed the box and placed it on his kitchen table. Tomorrow, he would need to make some very important decisions about his future and the future of the British monarchy. The king had dismissed him without a second thought, but this story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.